Psst. On a snowy night she knocked and begged, "Let me in or I'll die. You're my only hope." The night had come earlier than usual. The sky was heavy with clouds, and snowflakes fell thickly, drifting slowly to the ground. The whole town seemed to be wrapped in silence, the kind of quiet that made the world feel far away, except for the crunching of snow under occasional footsteps. Inside his small, warmly lit house, Daniel sat near the fireplace, sipping tea and thinking about the long day behind him. He enjoyed nights like this, quiet, calm, and peaceful. Found it. Outside, the snow covered everything in a soft white blanket. The trees, the streets, even the rooftops were transformed into shapes that looked like they belonged in a painting. Suddenly, a faint knock interrupted the silence. It was so soft that Daniel almost thought he had imagined it. He put down his cup carefully, the warmth of the tea fading as a sudden chill ran through him. Another knock followed, slightly louder this time, hesitant. He stood up and walked to the door. He peeked through the small glass pane and squinted into the darkness. At first he saw nothing but swirling snow, the wind moving it in patterns that made the world look unfamiliar. Then he saw her. She was standing there, barely visible through the storm, hunched over as though she was trying to hide from the cold. Her clothes were soaked, thin, and clearly not enough to protect her from the biting wind. Her hair clung to her face with frozen droplets of snow, and her skin was pale, almost gray. The fear in her eyes was immediate and raw. She looked at him as if he were her last hope. Daniel's heart tightened. There was something in her gaze that demanded help, not just a simple favor, but something deeper, almost desperate.
"Hi, please," she said in a voice so low it seemed like it might break entirely.
"Let me in, please. I can't stay out here. I'll die. You're my only hope." Her teeth chattered slightly as she spoke, and her words trembled with fear and exhaustion. Daniel's first thought was to ask questions, to understand who she was and why she had come to him. But even as he opened his mouth, he realized that the snowstorm would allow no time for hesitation.
Every second she spent out there was dangerous.
He didn't know her, didn't know what she had been through, but something inside him moved in response to her plea. With a deep breath, Daniel opened the door fully and held it out for her. She stepped inside immediately, shivering, wrapping her arms around herself as though to hold in what warmth she could. The contrast between the cold outside and the warmth of his house was striking. The smell of firewood and tea filled her senses, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, trembling sigh of relief. Daniel quickly closed the door, locking it, and turned toward the fireplace to offer her a blanket. "Here," he said softly, draping a thick wool blanket around her shoulders. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief, almost as though she couldn't understand that someone she had never met could help her. Her hands were red and stiff, her fingers barely moving as she tried to adjust to the warmth. Daniel went to the kitchen to make her some tea, pouring the water carefully so it didn't spill. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the kettle whistling and the fire crackling. As she wrapped herself tighter in the blanket, she sank to the floor, her back against the couch. She did not speak immediately, only letting out quiet, shallow breaths. Daniel handed her the cup of tea, watching her carefully. She accepted it with trembling hands and brought it close to her lips, blowing gently to cool it. Then, slowly, she drank. Betty, each sip seemed to bring a little color back to her face, a little life back to her body. The storm outside had left her weak and weary, and it would take time for her to regain her strength. Daniel sat across from her, trying to make sense of the situation. He was cautious by nature, but he had never seen fear like hers. There was no pretense, no exaggeration, Only the raw honesty of someone who had come face to face with danger. What happened? He asked gently, unsure if she would answer. Her eyes flickered up to him for a moment, then down to the floor. Breaths. She shook her head slightly, as though afraid that speaking might make the memory real again. It's hard to explain, she whispered finally. Her voice was quiet but filled with emotion, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. Daniel nodded slowly, realizing that sometimes it was enough just to be present, to provide shelter, to offer safety without demanding explanations. She didn't need him to understand everything immediately. She needed warmth, comfort, and a place to breathe. The night stretched on as the snow continued to fall. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the house, there was a fragile sense of calm. Daniel brought a second blanket and placed it over her, and she allowed herself to lean against him briefly, her exhaustion obvious. She had been running for hours, maybe even longer, through the snow, and her body had reached the limits of endurance. His house, with its fire and light, was the first place that had felt safe in what seemed like an eternity. As they sat together, Daniel noticed small details about her. The way her hands shook slightly, the way she avoided looking out the window. The tension in her shoulders. Everything told him that this was not simply someone lost in the snow. It was someone who had been through fear, who had faced dangers that left marks you couldn't see on the surface. And yet, despite all of that, she still had a fragile hope, still believed that there was a place in the world where someone would help. That hope was what had brought her to his door that night, and it was enough to make him act. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of stopping. Daniel offered her more tea and some dry clothes he had set aside for emergencies, but she hesitated at first, unsure if she could trust him completely. Slowly, she changed into the dry clothes, still wrapped in blankets. She sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into her frozen muscles. Every now and then she glanced at him with eyes that seemed to be silently asking the same question. Am I safe? Will I survive this night? Breath. Daniel didn't answer with words, but his calm presence and steady attention were reassuring. By the time the night grew deep and the snow seemed to fall harder, both of them had settled into a quiet rhythm. She had not yet spoken of the dangers she had faced, but her presence alone was enough to fill the room with tension and empathy at the same time. Daniel realized that sometimes the beginning of a story isn't about words. It's about an action, a decision, a single moment where someone's life can change because another person chose to open the door. Outside, the snow swirled like a white storm, covering everything in its path. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The woman, finally feeling some sense of safety, leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes for a moment. She was exhausted, but she was alive. Daniel watched her, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. This night had begun with a knock, a simple sound, but it had already become so much more. It had become a test of courage, trust, and human compassion. He realized that, in that quiet, snowy night, both their lives had shifted. For her, the simple act of being allowed inside had become hope. For him, the decision to open the door had become a promise, to protect, to care, to be there for someone in need. And as the storm raged on outside, they both knew that the night was far from over. Yet for now, there was safety, warmth, and a fragile sense of peace, a beginning that could change everything. The morning came slowly, with the storm outside still raging, though the snow had begun to fall a little more gently. Light filtered through the thick clouds and dusted the snow-covered streets with a dull gray glow. Inside the small house, the woman sat quietly by the fire, wrapped in the blankets Daniel had provided. She had managed a few hours of sleep, but her rest had been shallow, filled with dreams of running, hiding, and being trapped. Each sound from outside, the whistle of the wind, the creaking of snow-laden branches, made her tense, as though she were expecting someone to appear at the door. Daniel moved around the kitchen, trying to make breakfast quietly. He didn't want to rush her, but he also wanted to create a sense of normalcy. He cooked eggs and toast, and the smell began to fill the house, cutting through the heavy air of worry. She watched him from the couch, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket as though it were a lifeline. She wanted to speak, to explain everything, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she tell a stranger the life she had escaped from? How could she explain fear that had followed her for so long it had become a part of her? Finally, after a few minutes of quiet observation, she whispered, I need to tell you something. Her voice was hesitant, as though saying the words out loud might make the past come alive again. Daniel stopped what he was doing and turned to face her, giving her his full attention. He nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue, ready to listen without judgment. She took a deep breath, gathering strength from the warmth of the fire and the safety of the house. I was trapped, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Trapped in a place where I had no control over my life. Every day was difficult, frightening, and I felt like there was no way out. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't speak. Breaths. And then something happened, and I knew I had to run. I had to get away, no matter what. She paused, taking a shaky breath, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. Daniel stayed silent, sensing the weight of her words and the pain behind them. He didn't need to interrupt. She was revealing as much as she could, and that was enough for now. The woman's story was fragmented at first, told in short bursts, as though remembering too much at once might overwhelm her. She spoke of nights spent in fear, of people she could not trust, and of the constant anxiety that followed her everywhere.
She described walking through cold streets before the storm, avoiding anyone who might notice her, trying to disappear in the shadows.
Her eyes welled with tears as she recounted the moments when hope had seemed impossible, when every door she approached felt like it might be closed to her forever. Daniel listened carefully, offering the occasional word of reassurance, but mostly letting her speak. He realized that her fear was not just about physical danger. It was about the feeling of being invisible, of being powerless. She had lived with that fear for so long that even being in a safe place made her tense. Her body remained alert, every movement cautious, as though expecting danger to return at any moment.
And yet, despite it all, there was a quiet strength in her, a determination that had carried her through the storm and brought her to his door.
Breakfast was ready, but she barely touched it. Her appetite had been lost somewhere in the night, replaced by exhaustion and the lingering tremors of fear. Daniel encouraged her gently, insisting that she eat something, and eventually she managed a few bites, the warmth of the food slowly easing the tension in her body. As she ate, she began to tell him about the day she had decided to run. She described the fear that had almost paralyzed her, the moments when she doubted herself, and the courage it had taken to step out into the unknown. The moment I left, she said, staring into the fire. I felt like I was finally alive again, but also completely alone. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who I could trust. I walked through the cold for hours, hoping I would find someone, anyone who would help me. Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady now, revealing the resolve that had kept her moving. Daniel nodded, understanding the depth of her struggle. He felt a mixture of empathy and admiration. She had survived something that would have broken most people, and she had made it to his doorstep despite everything. After a while, the conversation shifted. She began asking him about the town, the streets, and the people. as though trying to distract herself from the memories she had just shared. Daniel answered patiently, sharing small, ordinary details, hoping to give her a sense of normalcy. Slowly, she started to relax, her tense posture softening, her breathing becoming steadier. It was clear that the safety of the house was beginning to sink in, though she was still wary. Trust, she knew, would take time. Brace. As the storm outside continued, Daniel offered to show her a warm place to rest more comfortably. He led her to a small guest room, simply furnished but cozy. The bed was covered in fresh blankets, and a small lamp gave the room a gentle, soft light. But she hesitated at first, then stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the blanket. Daniel assured her that she could stay as long as she needed, that there was no rush to leave, and that she could feel safe here. Her eyes reflected both relief and lingering fear, but for the first time there was a spark of hope in them. The hours passed slowly. Outside, the snow piled up higher, blanketing the town in white silence. Inside, the woman gradually began to open up more, recounting small moments of her journey, the ways she had avoided detection, and the little acts of courage that had kept her moving. She spoke of finding water, of sneaking past people, of the small joys she had discovered in fleeting moments of safety. Each story revealed a piece of who she was, a person shaped by fear but strengthened by determination. Daniel watched her, realizing that survival was not just about escaping danger. It was also about finding the strength to keep going, even when hope seemed impossible. He began to understand the enormity of what she had endured and the courage it had taken to reach him. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that his home had become her sanctuary. Every small gesture, offering food, blankets, a listening ear, was now a lifeline, something that could help her rebuild her sense of security. By late afternoon, the storm had begun to subside slightly, though the snow still fell in soft, persistent flurries. The woman, now feeling somewhat rested, looked out the window at the quiet streets. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a small smile. The world outside was still dangerous, still uncertain, but inside this small house, she had found a place of warmth and safety. Grasp. Daniel noticed the change, the subtle shift from fear to cautious hope, and it gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction. As evening approached, the fire flickered gently, casting long shadows across the room. They sat together in silence for a while, not needing words, both aware of the bond that had begun to form. Trust was growing slowly, like ice melting under the warmth of the fire. She knew she could not fully reveal everything yet, but she could rest here, heal, and prepare for the challenges ahead. Daniel understood that the night had been only the beginning, that her journey was far from over, but he also knew that she was no longer alone. That night, as the woman lay in the guest room, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: safety. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in white, but inside there was light, warmth, and quiet. She had survived the storm, she had survived the fear, and she had found someone willing to help her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she might be free, where she might have a chance to live without constant fear. And Daniel, sitting by the fire in the living room, thought about the strange way life sometimes worked. A knock on the door, a desperate plea for help, and suddenly 2 lives intersected in the middle of a snowy night. He did not know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew that opening the door had been the right choice. Sometimes he realized helping someone else could change not just their life, but your own as well. As the storm quieted, the night stretched on, filled with the soft sounds of the fire, the occasional gust of wind, and the quiet breathing of someone who had found a temporary refuge. For the woman, it was a chance to recover, to rest, and to gather the courage she would need for the days to come. For Daniel, it was a reminder of the power of compassion, of how one decision could make a difference between despair and hope. But in that small, warm house surrounded by snow and silence, life continued, fragile, uncertain, but filled with the possibility of a new beginning. The days after the storm passed were quiet, but the tension in the house remained. Snow still covered the streets outside, and the world seemed distant and unreachable. Inside, the woman moved slowly, still wrapped in the blankets that had become her constant comfort. She was eating more now, though cautiously, and speaking in small, measured sentences. Every movement carried a hint of nervousness, as though she were waiting for something to happen. Daniel watched her carefully, understanding that the fear she carried could not disappear in a single day. It had taken her months, perhaps years, to reach a place where she could even ask for help, and he knew it would take time for her to trust fully. Buff. She avoided looking out the windows for long periods, glancing only briefly to check for signs of anyone following her. Her eyes were always alert, scanning every shadow, every sound. Daniel noticed the way her hands sometimes trembled when she reached for objects, how she flinched at sudden noises, how she seemed to hold herself tensely even while sitting. He realized that the fear she carried was not just from the past few days. It was embedded deep in her, a survival instinct that had kept her alive. One afternoon, as Daniel prepared tea, she spoke hesitantly. "Bah, I don't know if I can trust anyone completely," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I've been hurt before and I don't want to make a mistake again." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind her words. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said gently. "Take your time."
I'm here, and I'll wait. No one is going to force you to do anything you're not ready for.
Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he saw a flicker of relief. The words offered a small comfort, but the wariness in her expression remained. Over the next few days, they fell into a careful routine. Daniel would cook, tend to the fire, and give her space when she needed it. She would stay in the warm room, sometimes reading, sometimes sitting silently, lost in thought. Occasionally, she would share small stories from her past. Nothing dangerous, nothing too revealing, just pieces of herself that she could safely offer. It was during one of these quiet moments that Daniel noticed something unusual. She had begun to look around the house, slowly, almost as if she were examining it for dangers. Her eyes lingered on the door locks, the windows, and the corners of rooms. She would sometimes check her pockets or the bag she had carried with her, as though she needed to know her belongings were secure. Daniel realized that for her, safety was not just about being warm and fed. It was about control, about knowing that she could protect herself if necessary. Despite this, small gestures of trust began to appear. She would drink the tea he brought her without hesitation. She would let him adjust the blankets on her shoulders, or help her with dry clothes. She began to ask questions about the town, the people, and life outside her immediate surroundings. Each question was cautious, careful, but it was a step toward connection. Daniel answered patiently, never pushing, never prying, simply providing information and comfort. One evening, as the sun set behind the snow-covered hills, she finally spoke about her journey in more detail. She described the hours she had spent walking through the storm, the fear of being followed, the exhaustion that had nearly stopped her in her tracks.
I thought I would never make it, she admitted, her voice shaking slightly.
Despair. Every step felt impossible. But I kept moving. I couldn't go back, not after everything. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Daniel nodded, offering no advice, no judgment, only silent understanding. The next few days brought small but important milestones. She began to leave the guest room occasionally, venturing into the living area, helping with simple chores, or sitting by the fire for longer periods. She still flinched at sudden noises or unexpected movements, but the flinches were less frequent. She began to smile occasionally, a small, fleeting expression that brightened her face and reminded Daniel of the person she could become once she was fully safe. Yet even with these signs of progress, Daniel could see that trust was fragile. She would sometimes glance nervously at the door or the window, as though expecting someone to appear. Desperation. She avoided phone calls and letters, unwilling to risk contact with the outside world. Daniel understood that these precautions were not meant to offend him. They were her way of maintaining control over a life that had once been taken from her. He respected her boundaries, knowing that pushing her too hard could undo everything they had built.
During one quiet afternoon, as snow continued to fall softly outside, they had a long conversation about life, fear, and hope.
She spoke of her dreams, the small joys she had missed, and the life she hoped to have one day. Daniel listened intently, offering encouragement without pressing her for details she was not ready to share. The conversation revealed her intelligence, her kindness, and her resilience. It also showed him how much she had endured and how remarkable it was that she had survived alone for so long. By the end of that week, a subtle shift had occurred. She began to speak more freely, laugh softly at small jokes, and even participate in small household tasks. Daniel noticed that she no longer flinched as frequently and that her posture was less tense. The fire in the fireplace mirrored the warmth growing between them. A warmth not just of physical comfort, but of trust and human connection. For both of them, the house had become a place where they could coexist safely, each respecting the boundaries and experiences of the other. But there were still moments of tension. One evening, a sudden knock at the door startled them both. The woman's body went rigid, and Daniel quickly moved to reassure her. It was just the wind against the old door, but the fear that it sparked reminded them both of the fragility of her trust. She clutched the blanket tightly, and Daniel simply sat beside her, offering a steady presence. No words were necessary. Sometimes the greatest comfort is simply being there for someone when they feel vulnerable. As the days turned into a second week, the woman's progress continued slowly but steadily. She began to talk more about the small details of her life, the hobbies she enjoyed, and the things that made her happy. She still avoided discussing the full details of her past, but she was beginning to share enough for Daniel to understand her character, her resilience, and her strength. Each story, each shared moment brought them closer together, building a foundation of trust that had seemed impossible when she first arrived. Daniel also began to notice changes in himself. He had opened his home out of instinct and compassion, but he had not anticipated the emotional impact of her presence. Her courage, even in fear, inspired him. Her gratitude, expressed in small smiles and quiet words, reminded him of the value of human connection. Each day, as he observed her growing strength, he felt a sense of pride, not in himself, but in her ability to survive and reclaim a part of her life that had been stolen. One evening, they sat by the fire, drinking tea in silence. She looked at him, her eyes softer now, and said, I don't feel as scared as I did when I first came here. Not completely, but I feel safer. I trust you, even if a little. Daniel smiled gently, understanding the significance of her words. Trust was not given lightly in her world, and the fact that she could speak those words, even partially, was a remarkable step forward. The days that followed were filled with a mix of routine, reflection, and small acts of connection. She helped with chores, shared small meals, and spent time simply being in the presence of someone who cared for her well-being. She began to laugh softly at things that amused her, and Daniel found himself sharing stories from his own life, not to impress her, but to create a sense of normalcy. Together, they formed a quiet bond built on patience, respect, and empathy. But yet the journey was far from over. Each moment of trust was precious and could easily be undone by fear, memories, or external danger. Daniel understood that her past experiences were not something that could be erased, only acknowledged and worked through slowly. He also understood that he had a role to play, not as a savior, but as a supporter, a presence she could rely on as she rebuilt her sense of safety. By the end of the third week, there was a noticeable change. The woman walked more confidently through the house, spoke more freely, and even looked out the windows without immediately flinching. The fire burned steadily, reflecting the warmth of progress that could be seen in her face and posture. She was still cautious, still aware of the fragility of trust, but she had begun to reclaim a part of herself that had been lost to fear and uncertainty. Daniel realized that helping her was no longer just about providing shelter or food. It was about offering understanding, patience, and consistent presence. Each day they spent together reinforced the idea that safety was not only about walls and locks, but about connection, empathy, and mutual respect. Together they navigated the delicate balance of building trust, acknowledging past trauma, and creating a space where healing could begin. As another snowy evening settled over the town, the woman sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and allowed herself to imagine a future that had once seemed impossible. She was beginning to see that trust could exist, that safety could exist, and that there were people in the world willing to help, even when life had been cruel. Daniel watched her, knowing that this fragile progress was a testament to her strength and resilience, and a reminder that compassion, patience, and understanding could make a profound difference in someone's life. The snow had mostly melted outside, leaving the streets wet and slippery under the gray winter sun. The world seemed quieter now, but inside the small house, the tension that had been slowly building reached a new level. The woman had begun to feel stronger, more capable, and yet there was still a piece of her past she had not shared. For days, Daniel had noticed subtle signs, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a tightened grip on the blanket, and the way she sometimes spoke in incomplete sentences, as if holding back something vital. Bounded. He had waited patiently, respecting her boundaries, but he knew that eventually the truth would need to come out. One late afternoon, as the wind rustled the bare branches outside, she turned to him, her face pale but determined.
I think it's time you know everything, she said quietly.
Daniel set down the book he had been reading and gave her his full attention, nodding gently. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She took a deep breath, gripping the edge of her blanket, and began to speak, her voice low but steady. "Best." "I wasn't just running from a storm or from being lost," she started. "I was running from people. From a life that wasn't mine. A life where I had no control, no voice, no freedom.
For a long time, I lived as if I didn't exist. I was told what to do, where to go, how to think.
For everything. And if I made a mistake, the consequences were terrifying. I felt trapped, and every day was a fight just to survive." Her words hung in the air, heavy with pain and courage. Daniel remained silent, letting her continue, knowing that listening was more important than speaking. She paused, looking down at her hands. "It was hard to leave. I thought about running for months, planning how I could escape without being noticed.
And the night I finally did, I didn't know if I would make it. I didn't know if I would survive the cold, the streets, or the people I was running from.
I just knew I had to try. And somehow, I ended up at your door." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady, reflecting a mix of fear and relief. Daniel could feel the weight of her words pressing into the room. It was not just a story of survival. It was a story of courage, resilience, and hope. The woman had faced unimaginable fear, yet she had taken action when it mattered most. He could see the truth in her eyes. The truth of someone who had lived through danger and hardship. Someone who had carried the weight of fear for far too long. He felt a deep respect for her strength, and at the same time a renewed sense of responsibility. Breaths. I want you to understand, she continued, that everything I've done, every step I've taken to survive has brought me here. To this moment. To you. I trust you because I have no choice but to trust someone now, and I feel... Breath. Safe with you.
Even if just a little.
Inspiration. Her words were raw and honest, and Daniel felt the gravity of the moment. Trust, in her world, had been earned through survival, not given lightly. And she had chosen to give it to him, even if partially, and that was remarkable. For a long time they sat in silence. Outside, the snowdrifts had begun to shrink under the weak winter sun, but inside, the warmth of the fire matched the intensity of their emotions. Daniel finally spoke, his voice gentle. Boss.
Thank you for telling me. I know it's not easy to share something so personal, so painful.
Verstensum.
I want you to know that I'm here for you no matter what. You're safe here, and you don't have to face anything alone anymore.
She looked at him, her eyes glistening with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Over the next few hours, she revealed more details, carefully and selectively. She spoke of the people she had escaped from, not naming names, but explaining the ways they had controlled her, how they had made her feel powerless, and how her spirit had almost been crushed. Death. She talked about the constant fear, the way she had learned to hide, to move silently, and to avoid drawing attention. Each story revealed her courage, but also the trauma she had carried for so long. Daniel listened, offering comfort and validation, letting her know that her feelings were real and her experiences mattered. As the day turned into evening, the conversation shifted slightly. She began to speak about her hopes, about the life she wished to reclaim. I don't want to live in fear forever, she said quietly. I want to find peace, even if it's small. I want to feel safe, to make my own choices, to be myself without worry. Round and Des. And I hope one day I can help others who are trapped like I was. Daniel nodded, understanding that her courage was not just about survival. It was about reclaiming a life that had been stolen, about building a future where she could be free.
They talked for hours, and with every word, the bond between them grew stronger.
Daniel realized that helping her was no longer just about providing food and shelter. It was about creating a safe space for her to heal, to find her strength, and to regain trust in the world. For her, this moment was transformative. Breaths. She had faced fear, taken action, and finally found someone who would listen without judgment. The sense of relief that washed over her was palpable, and for the first time in a long while she allowed herself to breathe fully. Night fell, and the house grew quiet. She sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Daniel watched her, realizing how much she had endured and how remarkable her resilience was. The truth she had shared was heavy, but it also brought clarity. He understood the depth of her fear, the courage behind every step she had taken, and the significance of her trust.
It was a reminder of how fragile and precious trust could be, and how important it was to honor it with care and respect.
Brian. Over the next few days, they settled into a new rhythm. The woman began to feel safer, more confident, and more willing to engage with the world outside the guest room. She started helping with small tasks, exploring the house, and even stepping outside, briefly under Daniel's careful guidance. Each step was cautious, but it was also a declaration of her growing strength. She was beginning to reclaim the life that had been denied to her, one small, deliberate action at a time. Daniel, too, learned from the experience. Wild. He realized that safety was more than just walls and locks. It was about trust, patience, and empathy. Every small moment, every shared conversation, and every act of kindness mattered. Bo, He saw how fragile trust could be, and how vital it was to nurture it carefully. He also saw how courage and resilience could inspire those around you, even in unexpected ways. One evening, as they sat together near the fire, she spoke about her plans for the future. "I don't know exactly what comes next," she said softly, "but I know I can't go back to the life I had. I have to keep moving forward, even if it's scary. I want to build a life that is mine, that I control, where I feel safe and free." Breath. Daniel smiled gently, impressed by her determination.
And you will,
He said,
I'll help you however I can, but the strength is already in you. You've come this far, and that courage will take you even further.
As the night deepened, the house was filled with a quiet sense of hope. The storm outside had passed, and though the world was still cold and uncertain, inside there was warmth, safety, and understanding. The truth had been revealed, and with it, a sense of liberation. She had shared the story she had carried for so long, and in doing so had taken the first step toward healing. Daniel knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that she was stronger than she realized, and that together they could navigate whatever challenges came next. The truth, once hidden in fear and silence, now shone clearly.
it was not just a story of danger and survival. It was a story of courage, resilience, and the human spirit's ability to endure. And as the fire flickered in the quiet room, both of them understood that this moment marked a turning point.
She had faced the past, revealed the truth, and begun to reclaim her life. And Daniel had become more than a helper. He had become a witness, a supporter, and a friend, ready to stand beside her as she moved forward. By the end of the night, she finally allowed herself to relax fully. The tension that had gripped her for so long began to ease, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope. The house, once just a refuge from the storm, had become a place of healing, a place where trust could grow, and a place where the possibility of a new life could begin. Outside, the world remained cold and uncertain, but inside, the warmth of truth, understanding, and human connection created a space where courage could flourish, and fear could slowly fade. The days slowly turned into weeks, and the snow outside had finally melted completely, leaving the streets wet and muddy from the thaw. The town seemed to breathe again, its usual sounds: children laughing, distant voices, the creak of wooden doors, returning after the long winter silence. Inside the small house, the woman had begun to feel a sense of normalcy she had not experienced in months, perhaps years. Each morning she awoke with a little more strength, a little more confidence, and a growing sense that the world could be safe if approached carefully. Daniel had watched this transformation with quiet pride. He had opened his door to a stranger on a snowy night, never imagining the depth of courage, fear, and resilience that would be revealed in the days that followed. Over time, the woman had grown from someone frightened and exhausted into someone capable of small acts of independence. She could make herself tea without shaking. She could walk through the house without constant fear, and she could speak about the past without trembling. But most importantly, she had begun to imagine a future, one that belonged to her and no one else. One afternoon, she sat by the window, watching the world outside. The streets were bustling again, and for the first time she considered the possibility of venturing beyond the safety of Daniel's home. It was a small thought, tentative and fragile, but it carried the weight of hope. Breath. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. I think I'm ready to take the next step," she said softly. Brave. Daniel nodded, understanding completely. He knew that her journey of healing and trust was not over, but she had reached a point where she could face the world outside her temporary refuge. Before she left, they discussed a plan. She would need to contact people she could trust, find a safe place to stay, and take small steps toward rebuilding her life. Daniel offered to help with whatever she needed, guidance, supplies, or simply a listening ear. She felt a mix of gratitude and relief, knowing that for the first time, she was not alone in making these choices. Every decision would be hers. And that freedom, once unimaginable, now felt within reach. The day of departure came quietly. The sun was shining weakly through scattered clouds, casting a gentle light across the melting snow. The woman had packed only what was necessary, leaving behind the weight of fear and uncertainty that had accompanied her for so long. She turned to Daniel, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Breaths. Daniel smiled softly, feeling a lump in his throat. "You did it yourself," he said. "You found the courage, you survived, and you are stronger than you realize. I only helped you see it."
The walk to the edge of town was cautious but steady.
Every step was a declaration of her regained strength, every breath a reminder of her freedom. She moved carefully, aware of the world around her, but no longer paralyzed by fear. Breaths. She glanced at Daniel one last time before stepping onto the main street. He watched her with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that the journey ahead would not be easy, but confident that she had the resilience to face it. As she reached the first few streets of town, she felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time, she was free to choose her path, free to make decisions, and free to reclaim the life that had been taken from her. The fear that had once dominated every moment had not disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced by courage. The kind of courage that comes from surviving, from refusing to give up, and from trusting oneself. The woman found a small place to stay, a modest room in a safe area of town. She began to reconnect with resources that could help her rebuild her life. Community programs, supportive friends, and people who understood the challenges she faced. Each interaction was a reminder that the world could be kind, that help existed, and that trust, once carefully given, could be rewarded. She began to see herself not as a victim, but as someone who had survived and now had the chance to thrive. Daniel returned to his home, the quiet house now feeling emptier without her presence. Yet he was filled with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had played a part in helping someone reclaim her life. He thought about the night she had knocked on his door, desperate and freezing, and marveled at how far she had come. That single act of opening the door had become a turning point for both of them, a moment that changed lives in ways neither could have imagined. Weeks turned into months, and the woman's life gradually began to take shape. She found work, built a routine, and began to make friends she could trust. Every day was a step forward, a careful but determined move toward independence. She still carried memories of fear, but they no longer defined her. Brace. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And in that knowledge, she discovered a new sense of strength and purpose. Occasionally, she would write letters to Daniel, sharing small victories and moments of progress. She described the small joys of her days, the sunlight on the streets, the laughter of friends, the quiet satisfaction of achieving goals. Each letter was filled with gratitude, not just for his help, but for the proof that kindness and trust could exist even in the darkest moments. Daniel kept each letter carefully, reading them when he needed a reminder of the profound impact one act of compassion could have on another person's life.
Over time, the woman began to think beyond her immediate survival.
She started to consider ways to help others who were in situations similar to the one she had escaped. She volunteered at community centers, shared her story with people who needed hope, and encouraged others to find the courage to take their first steps toward freedom. Her experience, once a source of fear and pain, had become a source of inspiration and empowerment. Through all of this, she never forgot Daniel, the man who had opened his door on a snowy night and offered her warmth, safety, and understanding. She realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could have the greatest impact. One decision, to trust, to care, to act, had saved her life and allowed her to reclaim it in ways she had never imagined possible. Years later, she reflected on that night and the journey that followed. The memory of standing in the snow, cold and desperate, was vivid, but it was no longer filled with fear. It was a reminder of courage, resilience, and the power of human connection. She had survived, grown stronger, and found hope. She had discovered that even in the darkest moments, there was a chance for light, for trust, and for life. Psh, and Daniel, in his quiet house, occasionally looked out the window during winter nights, remembering the knock on his door, the plea for help, and the courage of the woman who had walked through the snow into his life. He understood that life was full of unpredictable moments. Moments where a choice, an act of kindness, or a small gesture could alter the course of someone's world forever. And in that understanding, he found his own sense of peace and fulfillment. The woman's journey had been long and difficult, but it had led her to freedom, hope, and the knowledge that she could survive anything. She had faced fear, endured hardship, and found trust again. She had learned to move forward with courage, to embrace life fully, and to offer kindness to others as it had been offered to her. And in doing so, she became a living reminder that even in the coldest, darkest nights, hope could be found and lives could be changed forever. The world outside continued to move, filled with ordinary challenges and quiet miracles. And though she would always carry memories of fear and survival, she now had something stronger. A life she could call her own, a future she could shape, and the certainty that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The knock on that snowy night had begun a story of courage, compassion, and the human spirit, and now that story had grown into a life of hope, resilience, and new beginnings. In the end, the snowy night that had once felt like the end of the world became the start of a life full of possibilities. And though the woman and Daniel were no longer in the same house, the bond they had formed, the trust they had built, and the lives they had touched would remain a lasting testament to the power of kindness, courage, and human connection.